So today I'm going to be talking about writing and also speaking from an Australian perspective. And we've got a lot to thank, and we've heard from our American friends throughout the day, and we're really building on their shoulders and their really hard work. But we also have a unique culture and identity, and it's really important that we take what we can both from Britain and from America, but make sure that we are teaching our children our culture from our unique perspective, where it is divergent from them. So when we are looking at writing, it is more than just what I call the mechanics of the writing. So learning to paragraph and punctuate, to write a proper structured sentence. It is actually to preserve our history. That's why writing began. We want to be able to teach our children about our civilization. We want to communicate it and we preserve it. And probably over particularly last 30 or 40 years, parts of it have been lost, particularly when we consider history and the way in which history has been taught in schools. So anyone sort of myself and younger has been given a particular view of history. And that's not just about Australian history. I was interested today when we were having the session about the French Revolution. And I don't know about you, but when I was taught the French Revolution in my Australian school, I was taught that Marie Antoinette was a complete villain. She deserved everything that she got, and that the good guys were pursuing liberty, and anyone that stood in their way was naturally bad. And that's what I left school thinking, because that's what I was taught. Now, having read a little bit more on the information, I have a very different view of that particular period of time. But it just goes to show that we all will need to be humble in developing our skills and understanding, because we may find when we read and learn about history that we have not been given the full picture. Writing shapes identity. In Australia, we have really lost some parts of the writing skills when we compare ourselves, for instance, to Anzac letters. So if anyone has gone back and got some of those primary sources and read what just ordinary young infantrymen were able to write home to their mothers. In a moment, I'm going to show you a slide that talks about our current standards, and they're not even close. When we're writing, we're seeking to convey universal truths. Now, that's not just universal truths that we have developed, but go back to the Romans, the Magna Carta, Scripture. We are a very young country. And so we are not developing things out of whole cloth. We are building on what has been passed down to us. And so we have a strong educational task. And we want to ask ourselves, when you're in your classrooms, what are you trying to achieve when your students are completing a writing task? Sometimes I've gone into schools and it is just about this scope and sequence. Have I ticked the box? Have they done the assignment in order that I can report on it? So I just want you to have a chat to the person next to you. When you set a writing task, when you are working on a task, what are you setting out to achieve with the particular task you set? So just a quick minute, have a chat to the person next to you. All right, we'll come back. Just wanted you to keep that in mind when we look at what does a classical education want in terms of writing. What are we aiming to achieve? And see if what you're currently doing has that matched up. Now, I'm not data driven necessarily, but we have to keep in mind what the state of our writing is across this country. And more resources are going into education, and yet our writing standards continue to decline. Now, I think we know largely some of those reasons, and it was presented earlier today. The increase in online usage has led a decrease in reading, and I think we need to consider the correlation between excellence in writing is tied to excellence also in reading. And if as a society we are no longer reading good literature, we can't model what has gone before us, and then we're failing to be able to produce in any quality. But really it's a national scandal that 52.6% of boys are not meeting the minimum standard. Now the minimum standard is extraordinarily low. I don't know if anyone's had a look at what that minimum standard is, but that means they can't write a paragraph. They can't function with a full sentence. They have an inability to use correct punctuation, capitalization, spelling errors, let alone conveying anything of meaning. And the girls, whilst better, are still extraordinarily low, 1 in 3. Now, one of the buzzwords I've seen in education, and this is why I wanted to bring it up, is the new word mastery learning. Now, we in classical education, of course, do believe in mastery learning, but it doesn't stop there. And so we need to be very careful when choosing programs and considering how we're going to approach writing, that it is not just limited to the writing techniques. They're very important and they must be taught. However, if we see in our wider society mastery learning, and I've seen it become a very big buzzword, that is a mirage of only one aspect of writing. It is not going to be the full picture. So this implication means we need to do something about our writing. Our foundational skills are compromised, and it brings 2 challenges, which I'll talk to in a moment. And so I think we all acknowledge, even outside the classical educational domain, that something needs to be done about the writing. But what? I likened our current writing to, and the gentleman before almost stole my analogy with the tennis coaching, but I likened the way we currently teach writing to putting a racket in a child's hand, and we say, here is the tennis court, here is the scoring rules, you hit forehands and backhands, play. Because you've got so much natural talent in you that you will be a master on the tennis court. Now, if your tennis coach said that to your child, you would run as far as you could, as quickly as you could, because you know it's a disaster. And yet that's what we're offering in many classes across the country. So we need to regain the foundational skills. So just as, if anyone's had their tennis coaching, you'll spend some time on the forehand. It'll be 10 minutes on the forehand, 10 minutes on the backhand, okay? Your volley and your serves. That is akin to working on traditional grammar, isolated from your writing. So if you are wanting to start developing your writing programs, that's where you need to start. Now, I can tell there'll probably be some teachers, myself, because anyone who's younger than me will be in the same boat. I wasn't taught traditional grammar at all. I was barely taught what a noun was, what a verb was, anything beyond that, and I am shaking with anxiety. And that's okay. And this is where we come back to what was talked about at the start of the day, is that teachers need to have courage and humility themselves. And to say, I'm trying to recreate something I didn't have. And it's okay to say, I don't know traditional grammar. I want to give it a go. Give me the resources, support me to do that. And I'm going to implement that in my classroom. Will you make mistakes? Of course. And that's okay, because the parents know you're giving them something that you may not have had. And you'll teach it for the first time, and the second time you'll be better, and the third time you'll be better. And each time you develop the course and you improve your skills, and there are plenty of resources out there. We had some of our friends from Classical Academic Press, and I think it's a wonderful program to start with a teacher who has no idea about grammar. The answers are there, the student workbook is there, the recitations are there, and it's a really wonderful place to start. It doesn't mean you would use that program or programs like that forever, but they are programs that can be used excellently to build teacher confidence. Second, an explicit spelling program is essential that is scoped and sequenced. I was talking to a school last week, and they were going on about mastery learning, and then they said to me, oh yes, and in our new program we're teaching spelling in context of our literature. And I thought, well, you don't understand what mastery approach to education is. So we need to treat each of these grammar and spelling in isolation that then will form part of your writing program. Now, what does the program look like? Well, there are a number of different writing programs that come about. The Progymnasmata is one such program which comes from the ancient Greeks. And there are a number of programs. We've got one in here in Australia. There is also Memoria Press, which you're probably familiar with, as well as Classical Academic Press. All based on the same philosophy, is that we seek, and this comes back to the point I was asking you before, what are you trying to do when the children are writing? Okay? We seek moral truths. First of all, to learn them, and then to write about them. And that's two parts of the equation. Using a progymnasmata starts off always with a written piece of work. Now, in the very young year levels, that is starting with the fables. Okay, and you spend 6 months just on fables. And that comes back to that principle, multa non multa. And I don't remember Christopher Perrin, he talked about that this morning, okay? You want to reduce what you're doing. We're used to saying, let's go to a persuasive writing, and then we go to narrative writing, and then we're in poetry writing, and we're moving from one to the other because that's what the Australian curriculum tells us. No, you want to focus in on one, move slowly and master it. So you want to build foundational skills in a clear and structured way. So this program actually goes over 12 years. Oh, sorry, not 12 years, 12 semesters. So it's a 6-year program. And so we commence with imitation. So as you can see, the tortoise and the hare be one of the fables that you would do. You read the fable, and you commence with copy work. So if you've been conducting classical education, usually Prep 1-2 will have been based on using copy work, very little individual writing program. And so around grade 3, you would commence this with the proviso. Now, I actually left school education about 4 years ago and made the decision to homeschool my own children. And out of that, and I call it sort of providence, I was contacted by a number of homeschool parents, said, could you start something online? And I've been very blessed now to be running some programs online, and I know there was a lot of teachers here, but in fact, lots of homeschool parents will be coming tomorrow, and in fact acknowledge that there are 2 homeschool parents here who've actually flown from Adelaide and Cairns, which shows such a dedication as well to their children. At this level, it's very minimal additional writing of their own. So there might be application of 1 or 2 sentences, there'll be activities such as teaching about dialogue, but still a lot of copy work with a bridge to writing independently. One of the key things that I introduce, and I think it should be done across all schools, whether you're in literature or in a writing program, is annotation. I think one of the best gifts you can give the children is that, and I think this is where you can get to virtues, but I have 4 things that I do in terms of annotation. So if I've got a fable, the children learn that they have to circle unknown words, okay, or phrases. It takes courage in a class to put your hand up when you do not understand a word. And that is a way in which you can put the virtues that was talking about in the last section here, and say, in my class, if you don't know something, it's courageous to put your hand up. These conditions need to be set up beforehand. Secondly, I use an arrow. Is there anything that you can compare to either outside this text or might have happened earlier in the story? The third, they have to write any questions, anything that they're unsure of what's happening in the story. You know, why did this character do this? Why is this location there? And then the last thing is an exclamation mark where they put anything that has surprised them. This allows students time to think about what is being conveyed. It then allows discussion to occur in the classroom without just reading through and at the end sort of saying, what was that about? You give them a time to think about and give a process to reflect and question. Now, the other thing I start very early on is poetry recitation. Now, this is very important in developing speaking skills. We want to build their oral fluency. We want them to use their memory and expressive rhythm. We want to begin them voice, phrasing, and emotional depth. And you do this very easily for young children by giving them something, A, that is very worthwhile morally for them to learn, and secondly, also something that they can analyse with you in the classroom where you can teach each of these things. Now, you would only teach this in a gradual way. You're not going to do it all at once, so it could just be voice with the first poem. And the second poem, it might be expressive rhythm. And so you gradually build the skills as you are going. It's not we do everything all at once. And it can be at different paces for different students. Some children memorise things very quickly and have natural exuberance and are able to convey emotion very well. Others, that's a big challenge. So this is where you can certainly differentiate. Now, what's unique about our Australian poetry? So I thought today one of the things I'm just going to give is a little bit of information on different poems and different poets that you might not have heard of, or you probably have heard of some of them, but why you might want to choose some of these poems. Okay, so here are some Australian poems to recite. So Henry Lawson, Up the Country in 1892. So key themes of this particular poem is he's a very big critic in the harshness of bush life. So he critiques romanticism, which was strong just before that time. He looks at the rural struggle and the old Australian endurance. Now, I have some young boys in my classes and they love these two because they don't think of poetry as being a critique. But here we come. And so it's a good way to parallel these two together in defence of the bush. And so Banjo Patterson comes back and says, and it's an age-old discussion, is the city or the bush better? And it's not a new discussion. And yet you've got here from one poem to the next, the two famous Australian poets having a discussion. And so they really delight, and it can then lead to discussion about what is best. And you're seeing the uniqueness. And I love this because it shows everything that is old is also new. Okay, and so you've got this old discussion which still continues today, and you've got Up the Country and in the defence of the bush. I love the irony of the old Australian ways, because you'll note the date being 1902. The old Australian ways, it's a little ironic in one way because Australia only was established 1 year before. And so what it is trying to convey that yes, Australia was federated and yet it had been around for a long period of time as well. That each of the colonies was bringing a distinct part of Australia together, but that we had been forming for a long period of time a distinct identity away from England and Ireland. And these are the conversations you can start just to have a chat to the children about, okay? But they are gaining the foundation. They don't need to know much more other than the 1902 poem, but you can mention federation with the young children. John O'Brien is one of my favourite Australian poets. He wrote, and all these poems that I'm going to talk about come from around the Borrelog. So I highly recommend, if you don't have a copy of this book, that you get one. He is actually was a Catholic priest. And in fact, where I currently live and I moved to was his main parish for most of his life down in, so he's down in the Riverina. You might have heard of this poem, Said Hanrahan, and I think this is an absolute classic that all children should, and the famous line that still will be repeated today, which is, "We'll all be ruined," okay, in accents most forlorn. But that repetition, and I think that really, again, gives an insight to the unique Australian culture. Another one I really like, again, is The Little Irish Mother, okay, and so this one is about the hard work of women, mothers, obviously in particular, living in harsh rural life. Often the men had to go off, and valuing that role of mother. And again, education and school, and valuing school when it was really very difficult and very old. And if the children ever complain about their conditions, this is a very good one for them to have an understanding of. Now, I was going to play just an example, because one of the hesitations I think teachers often have, and they say to me, is, my class could never do this. The students in my class couldn't, and I admit it is a challenge the first time, both for yourself to understand the ability of children to memorise, for parents to understand. You know, if you send home a 9 or 10 verse poem, they think it seems insurmountable. But actually, there's an enormous joy when they finally realise that they can do it. And so it's worthwhile persevering. And I think the first time they do a poem, and I in fact had a young boy who joined a class, and most of the children in my classes are very used to doing poetry, so they don't even blink an eye when they get their next poem. And in fact, I've got one girl who demands it, and she's very keen to have her poem. When are we getting it? But this young boy came in and said, I can't, well, he didn't say to me, I can't do it. He said to his mother. And his mother sort of emailed me and said, I really want him to do it, but he's saying he can't. And I said to him, okay, let's just start with the process. You only have to do 4 verses. I'm cutting it down to a third. And the next lesson he said, actually, it wasn't that hard. I think I can do more. And so sometimes it is just about saying, there's no getting out of this, you are doing this, and then they realise that they can have some success. So I was going to show you some example, but I don't think I'm hooked up to the audio, so I'll just skip that slide and keep going. The second area of the progymnasmata is narrative. Okay, so as I said, you start with fables and then you start with narrative writing. Again, you send 6 months. You're looking at a variety of different narratives, and this would be similarly done in schools. The difference is the moral focus of the story selection chosen. Okay, we might include some primary source excerpts as well where relevant at this level. The use of dictation, and I'm just giving you some samples that you can use in class. Dictation is excellent, particularly if you're wanting to develop and build background knowledge. So for instance, if you are doing a historical narrative, like I've got in this one, Simpson and his donkey, okay, a story in regards to that. You might want to do some little excerpts of primary source analysis. And remember, you're at a very young level, so you're just introducing children to the concept. You might get 3 or 4 lines from a letter from a young man written in Gallipoli, okay, that gives a little bit of the context, or a painting that might have been done. And this introduces the children, but at a very accessible level, to the kind of work that we want. I really like dictation exercises that are focused on what you're covering in class, because it's the background information, as well as, of course, you can use it as formative assessment as well. Another quick example is I use is Andrew Lang's The Bunyip, which is an Australian Aboriginal myth. And so I know we need to make sure that we're including some of these stories, and this is one of the good stories that you can include. It shows, again, the universal notion of myths, that there is an animal who personifies evil. that these are universal truths known by all people at all time, even if they haven't been introduced, that sort of that natural law understanding. And so in this particular story, if you hadn't read it, and most of the old stories are all available on Gutenberg Press, so you can have a look at them. This is and he's known in very different ways. Sometimes he's got yellow eyes, sometimes he's got red eyes, but he's a creature to be feared, okay, and steered clear of. And in this particular story, some young boys go and steal the cub off its mother, and it has some dastardly consequences. And so again, you've got a moral story of injustice towards someone and the consequences that they face. And then the students will annotate, and allows you to dissect through questions and answers. The next level is called Crayer and Proverbs. So this is the third year. You'd be in basically grade 4. This then starts the very beginning of persuasive writing. And so again, this is a big difference in classical education to more traditional writing. More traditional writing in our modern sense would have students writing persuasive much earlier, or at least what would allegedly persuasive. But children really don't have the capability. So this is a bit of a bridge from narrative. You're still using narrative skills, but you're incorporating some analysis. So a crayer is a brief story centered on a wise saying on action by a notable person. And so you're discussing the children, why they're notable, why they're worthwhile. And that comes back a little bit before to Joel, who was talking about ethos, credibility in the person conveying information. Now, at a rhetoric level, you're wanting to be the credible person writing. At a grammar level, we're just introducing children to the idea that they should read someone who is credible. So they just get introduced to the idea, and we say, these people are credible, that's why we're interested in what they're writing. So you're building just the foundational knowledge. They've got no idea of sort of really why they're credible, but you're just introducing that concept so that when they start to write later at logic and then the rhetoric level, they've got the background knowledge. So the kind of skills that are explored here, you're starting to get more complex writing. So you're paraphrasing, you're analysing, you're introducing sort of compare and contrast, and the notion of testimony and credibility, and the epilogue. Now, of course, these take 6 months. So if we just sort of consider just very briefly what that means in terms of a mastery, you would spend 2 weeks, say, on analysing. Then in the next fortnight, you would start to teach the children to contrast, but they're still writing the analysing paragraph. Then in the next fortnight, you add in comparison, but they're still developing analysing, contrast and comparison, but each time they're doing it to a different crayer or proverb. So it's a mastery-based approach. You're coming back, and I think Christopher Perrin talked about this morning, where when we're talking about memory and repetition, that memory and repetition does not have to be over the same material over and over again. In this context, you're still developing, getting feedback on each of these skills, but introducing new information to keep the children engaged. So a couple of examples of people you could include in here. Arthur Phillip. And so I just want you, as we're going through here, how well do you know each of these people? You don't have to put your hand up and say how well you know, but each of these people, how much information could you tell the person next to you about who this is? What role they had in Australia? What their character was like? And this is why I'm sure some of you are saying, probably not much. Some of you maybe a little, maybe vaguely. Someone actually, who used to be at a school I taught down in Victoria, I asked this person before, and the first comment she said was, Phillip Island was what came to her mind. It wasn't relevant at all, and then had a little bit more information. But Arthur Phillip, of course, was our first governor. Okay, for the New South Wales colony. He also was an outstanding Christian man. And this is where we start getting the uniqueness of our Australian culture compared to America. And this is where we want the students to have a bit of a background, and where the dictation and building their background knowledge comes into play. Because with Arthur Phillip, students would need to understand his role, and the quote that I'm just about to say. Students have to understand that slavery did exist in the 100 or 200 years or 300 years in America. And it was, Australia's founding was extraordinarily unique. Now, I know we paint a very dark picture of our colonisation, but actually for the time it was extraordinarily unique. And in fact, and this is where we have to think about being proud of our history, proud of our culture. And in order to do that, we need to know it well ourselves. So for instance, this is a quote, and this is a crayon that I would use. There are laws of this country will, of course, be introduced in New South Wales. And there is one that I would wish to take place from the moment His Majesty Force takes possession of the country, that there can be no slavery in a free land and consequently no slaves. And so what a unique and proud moment in history that is. Something that we want our students to understand and know and be aware of. And it takes time to build the background knowledge, to then have them discuss and articulate and then write about Arthur Phillip. St Mary of the Cross MacKillop, I think, is a profound person that we want to write. And again, these are people that I have chosen as having strong credibility. Their testimony is worthwhile. It is valuable for us to know. I was actually very lucky enough to be at her canonisation in Rome, and so it gives me a lot of delight. And so her very famous saying, and she has many, and you can pick out many. These are just some people that might consider never see a need without doing something about it. I've kept people sort of in a chronological order, but she, of course, comes from and was born in Melbourne in Fitzroy. And she's a wonderful person to study because she actually faced a lot of suffering and persecution from the church and yet maintained her faith. She was actually excommunicated from the church for a period of time and reinstated. So she's a really good model for people to understand that there will be difficulties and challenges in life. Archbishop Mannix. Now, you probably can tell that I am actually Catholic. So, of course, if these are just ideas, there will be similar identities that could be used from other traditions as well. Archbishop Mannix is very prominent for conscription. And so, again, this is introducing ideas, it's introducing principles, again, at a very low level. If students have studied Story of the World, for instance, they will have to study the notion of rules and laws. They'll have gone back to Harambe, and then they'll have come through the Magna Carta. So they have understanding of different roles and citizens in society. If you've got a strong background, then connecting to quotes like this is perfectly accessible. If students haven't done a rigorous history program or aren't studying it at the same time, then you're probably sitting there going, there's no way my class could manage that. And so that's where in classical education, all the school needs to be working all together across all areas. Sir John Monash. Now, Sir John Monash is a Jewish Australian, and it's a good way to introduce some cross-faith. He also, the boys particularly love it in my classes because he's a war hero. Okay, particularly at the Battle of Hamel. And again, you're building that background information for students to understand. And of course, if you've ever lived down in Victoria, which I did, Monash is everywhere. Now, each of these quotes, though, brings out morally good things for the children to ponder. So he said, equip yourself for life, not solely for your own benefit, but for the benefit of the whole community. And that's a profoundly good thing for children to ponder and to write on. And the last one I'll just mention briefly is Dame Enid Lyons. Dame Enid Lyons was the first woman to be elected to the House of Representatives. She's obviously also was the wife of a former Prime Minister. She also was a mother of 12 and a devout Catholic. And so again, the fact that I know many people have never heard of her and don't know her, and we should know her, and we should reclaim our culture and be able to proudly discuss the effects. She said the home is a foundation of the nation. And so again, it's a profoundly good thing to reflect on. Now I'm going to run out of time, so I'll just quickly finish off the next one, and then it gives you a bit of a flavour. So refutation and confirmation is the next. It's the fourth area in this series. And so again, we're increasing incrementally. This is more about persuasion, but still using a narrative as the basis. We give students a structure. So they're not just randomly saying, what arguments do I think, what do I like? No. We are telling them you need to explore and examine what in this story was obscure, what was incredible, what was impossible, what's illogical, what's unfitting and unprofitable. The stories are getting longer and they have to analyse. They're using those annotation skills that we started back in Fables, where we were just simply looking for words we didn't understand, where we were looking for connections outside the text, where we were looking for things that were surprising questions. We're now elevating. They're still looking for those things, but they've now had that for 3 years. We're now adding to the complexity. And once they analyse and they identify these things, they then need to write a story. Now, I wanted to bring in some actual work. I don't know how easily it's going to show. I was going to be in a smaller group, but this is essentially a structured approach to writing. So when we talk about the progymnasmata, we don't jump from reading the story to writing. Everything is broken down with series of questions. The students would answer these questions individually first, then you would seek to discuss them, then you would seek to have the students write it up. Now, I don't know if you've ever read The Loaded Dog, but it is hilarious. It's a very, very funny story, and particularly boys will absolutely love it. So when I tell them they're writing a refutation, so they're telling me why it is not worthwhile to read, giving them guidance, it really makes them think in greater detail. Now, you could easily write why you love this story and it would be good to read, but the point in the younger years is you are focusing them in on the areas that they have skills over, and that is not really deciding at a higher order level whether they agree or disagree with something. They just don't have the background capability to do that. So this is an example of a young boy. He has been taught that he has to have his the title in, the author he's got. He's got some quite sophisticated language here, again, because he's been reading and we use vocabulary. So the comedic story about 3 men, a dog and a badly thought act plan is the Australian outback. This story should not be read as it could encourage people, trivialise the danger of working with explosives, leading to potentially dangerous circumstances. Creating explosive is a highly illogical thing to do, as it could easily backfire and cause serious damage. It is also unfitting to make light of seriousness of the problem in the story, as this may cause us to be less wary in other dangerous scenarios. So that's just an example. I've run out of time, so I'm going to have to stop there, but thank you very much for attention, because I know it is very late in the day and you've been talked at a lot. So thank you very much.